And tonight I just want to put some things into perspective. I started really talking about the killing in Eastern Europe in my last lecture, how that really starts to begin. But now I want to kind of try to put this within the same context as some other events, like the development of the death camps, as well as the construction of the ghettos. So I'm going to go over a few different points, and then I'm going to ask you to watch 2 short films. Okay, I had mentioned the euthanasia program, and again, this is the project that the Nazis begin actually before the Second World War. They officiated, remember Hitler sort of signs the official paperwork for the founding of the program on September 1st, 1939, because he wants very much for this project to be viewed within the same context as the war. You know, he wants people to see it as really sort of part of the war effort, part of this project. Now, well, what is it? Euthanasia. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the term, which I believe means good death. It's really just one of these phrases that's often used as a kind of reference to mercy killing. You know, people euthanize their pets, for example. But there really isn't anything humane about this particular program that the Nazis are carrying out, although they certainly present it that way in the beginning. I also refer to it as the T4 program, and I do want you to remember that. That name, of course, as I mentioned last time, comes from the address of the administrative headquarters for this medical program, which is Tiergartenstraße, right? So it's the street address, Tiergartenstraße, number 4 in Berlin. And we know that as early as the spring of 1939, the very beginning of 1939, medical professionals are required by law to register and report all children that are born with mental and physical disabilities to the Reich Ministry, Ministry of Domestic Affairs. Now, so that begins a little bit early. They're already sort of collecting data and getting as much information as they can about who's disabled, who has hereditary defects, and related conditions. Now, by the fall of 1939, so after the program is sort of officiated, parents are actually encouraged to drop off, if they have disabled children, to drop them off at these public wards, these sort of public clinics, where, I mean, they don't tell them they're going to, kill their children, but they're told, basically that they're going to be cared for, and in fact they are killed. I mean, this is what happens. Now, this killing project is taking place in public institutions, mainly, places where children had either been put up for adoption or were left in public care, but it also is slowly implemented in private institutions as well, other sort of hospitals and facilities and nursing homes. Now, probably about 5,000 children are initially killed under sort of the early phase of this euthanasia program. So it's primarily focused on children. So in 1939, we're talking about roughly 5,000 or so children. By January of 1940, the program is expanded to include adults. Let me just back up for a second, too. When I'm talking about children being killed, I think I mentioned this already. There's a number of different ways they do this. They sometimes inject a child with poison, or they induce a sort of overdose. They give a lot of, an overdose of medication to a child. But a lot of times they just simply leave the child uncared for. Okay, so basically the child starves to death. or dies of illness or something similar. So this is how they really, that's where those death numbers come, 5,000. And then usually they report on the death certificate that a child died of either, a contagious disease of some kind or some other condition. They certainly make up medical conditions, which they then send that information to the families. And this goes on for quite some time. Later, they expand this program, of course, to include adults. So by January of 1940, you have large numbers of adult, along with children as well, mentally and physically disabled people being killed. And again, this is both in actually public and private institutions, where they're brought by bus, these sort of fairly large medical buses, which take them to specific locations. Sometimes these locations are other medical institutions or other public institutions that have been equipped with gas chambers, for example. In some cases, they have gas chambers in the basements of these buildings. Other times, they just simply have a number of vans or ambulances, right? And they seal up the ambulance and then just sort of feed the carbon monoxide into the back of the vehicle and kill people that way. Other times they run the carbon monoxide into a chamber, into a particular building, and that's how they gas people in large numbers, sometimes that way. It's estimated about 70,000 people were killed between January of 1940 and August of 1941 in this euthanasia program. And as I had mentioned last time, it is known. I mean, it's a public program. People are aware that it exists, but they're under the impression that it's something that's voluntary, at least on the part of the families, that people who, in other words, request this for their loved ones, that their loved ones be euthanized, are involved in it. So people aren't aware that large numbers of people are being killed, say, against, not necessarily with their family's consent, certainly not with their consent. And that slowly, begins to leak out as they send back ashes, for example. Strange things would happen. They would send back urns, right, with a death certificate saying, your child, father, mother, brother, whatever, had died of. They usually make up some illness, sometimes tuberculosis or cholera or some similar terrible disease or illness, and say, the person died this way. And then what happens is people investigate. They start to notice little things that seem strange. For example, finding shrapnel in a child's ashes. So this tells them, at least, that people are being cremated collectively. That this isn't the case of just a child or a relative dying and then being sent to a funeral parlor, which then cremated the body. They begin to realize there's something more, sort of massive and sinister going on. Anyway, there are protests, and certainly members of the churches do come out and protest this program. People are upset by it, and Hitler decides, or at least he publicly says, he's going to close it down. So already 70,000 killed, but in 1941, by the summer of 1941, Hitler says, okay, clearly people aren't happy about this, we're going to shut the program down. Of course, he's just saying that. I mean, technically, yes, on the paperwork, the program's closed down, but it continues. The project continues. They recruit medical professionals who are sort of on board with this idea. Certainly many of them are interested in getting promotions and perhaps good positions, government positions possibly, in other facilities. So they go along with this. I had asked you to read Lifton. I'm not sure if that particular excerpt now probably doesn't go into too much detail about the reasons, about all of the reasons medical professionals were involved in the killing, but opportunism and certainly the desire to advance one's Korea, I'm sure played a role in many of their decisions to join this project. All right, so technically it's supposed to be not happening. It's the program's been shut down 1941, and as I said, it continues. And they have lists. They know where disabled people and children are. They still have the wards. I mean, people are still actually dropping off family members, and they're still killing them. So probably another 200,000 would eventually be killed in Germany. So we're just talking about Germany. We know at least 30,000 physically and mentally disabled were also killed in Poland, sort of an extension of this project later. And we don't necessarily have the specific statistics, but there are reports of mentally and physically disabled people being killed pretty much wherever the Germans invaded, at least in Eastern Europe. Don't really have those reports from Western Europe so much, but we certainly have them from Ukraine, Poland, and certainly parts of Russia during the war, where the disabled are killed. So we don't really have that exact a statistic, but certainly we know at least 200,000 in Germany, and you figure in Poland they know 30,000, so it's probably considerably higher than that. All right, so the T4 program certainly shows what direction Nazi policy is going. Clearly, it's an example of eugenics, the idea of sort of removing what you don't want in your Volksgemeinschaft, that negative eugenics. That aspect of it. Of course, positive eugenics would be these programs where they encourage the production of what they deem as valuable life. And they do this too. They institute programs, for example, where they provide generous government loans that, in which the payment is reduced depending on how many children you have. So you say I'm just grabbing a hypothetical number here. Let's say you take out a loan for $10,000 or 10,000 marks or whatever, Reichsmarks. Then maybe if you have one child, they'll reduce it to 8,000. If you have two children, they'll reduce it to 7,000. If you have three children, they'll reduce it even further. If you have 5,000, if you have 5 children, they might even reduce the loan completely. Now, I'm not sure. I'd have to double check the exact. I was just trying to give an example. Your book might give more specific information about that. But again, this is sort of part of what might be called positive eugenics. So the idea is you try to encourage so-called Aryan families to produce more children. And how you do this is you give them certainly financial incentives. Another thing they do is they even give medals. They have something called the Mother's Cross, the Mutterkreuz, in which they sort of award this to women who have 5 or more children. And usually it's published, in the local community paper. These are all kinds of different ways of just sort of encouraging the production of so-called valuable life. Later they experiment with some different things which don't necessarily really take off. Things like the Lebensborn project, which has sort of different components to it. One of those components, unfolds during the war. For example, when they invade into Eastern Europe, if they find, for example, Polish children who look like they might be German, and the reason for this is there's, over the centuries, there is in fact a lot of mixture of cultures between Poland and Germany. So, whether or not it's really measurable the way the Nazis measure it, certainly they believe, if they come across a blonde-haired, blue-eyed a child, for example, who has features they like, they might consider that child to be an Aryan. How one would prove, for example, that the child is ethnically German is difficult, probably in most cases. In some cases, they know there are ethnic Germans, for example, that live in Poland. They sort of speak German. They're descended from Germans that had found themselves, sort of behind the borders in Poland over time. But you also have a lot of what the Germans would have considered Untermenschen, subhumans, Slavs, regular Poles. But for whatever reason, they choose to ignore this sort of category if they like the way the child looks, if they think the child can be passed off as an Aryan, and they bring many of those children back to Germany and give them to SS families that don't have children of their own, for example. That's part of this Lebensborn. I don't have it up here on the slide, but I don't think I do. But I'll spell it for you: Lebens, Lebensborn, BORN program. And another component of this, which was not used very much, was to encourage young women to go to particular locations where they would meet with young SS men, have sex, become pregnant, and then give those children up for adoption, for example, back in Germany. Now, not very many women volunteered for this project, and it certainly wasn't really publicized a great deal because it would have upset a lot of people. But in certain areas, they did try it, and some women did volunteer to do this. Not a lot, but this is again just sort of an example of their ideological use of eugenics. The idea that they're going to produce this Aryan Volksgemeinschaft, while at the same time removing mentally, physically disabled people who they see as sort of a kind of cancer, a kind of illness within this racial community, people's community that they're trying to create. Okay. Well, the program continues, as I said, throughout the war, and then that technology, this sort of, or at least technique anyway, of using vans and constructing sort of makeshift gas chambers in public institutions, is then really, transported into the camp system, and they begin to use those vans both in the camps. Eventually, they construct their own gas chambers. But also, they just use them as sort of mobile units. I'll talk about this in a moment. As the German army is fighting, the Wehrmacht is fighting, invading into Russia. You also have these other troops, these SS troops, these Einsatzgruppen, also these police battalions, which you read about in Browning's piece, the Order Police. Many of them are also involved in sort of organizing these vans, using these sort of ambulances, and killing large numbers of people in those vans as they invade. So that technology very much and that approach becomes fairly consistent with the Germans. All right, one of the other major developments that takes place shortly after the war is this idea of resurrecting the ghetto. Okay, and as I had mentioned last time, ghettos were really, this concept that it existed very early on, as far back as the 16th and 17th centuries, maybe earlier possibly, but certainly by the 16th and 17th centuries in Europe. And I already talked about that, where you had Jewish communities living. Now, they bring back the idea, right? And again, they either use existing Jewish ghettos and just simply seal them off, and in some cases they just carve out districts, certain parts of cities, and they begin to have Jews move into them. They also do this, by the way, with the Roma and Sinti, the so-called gypsies. They create also ghetto areas for them, not as many, but they do this as well. And they begin to relocate these populations into the ghettos. And the way they're structured, well, first of all, they really come into existence I said, certainly the planning may have begun as early as 1939, but it's really not until 1940 that we start to see the ghettos being used fairly regularly. And Heinrich Himmler, leader of the SS, was in charge of really organizing and structuring these ghettos. And of course he had lots of help. People like Heydrich, who I had mentioned before, and Eichmann and others were certainly involved in sort of organizing and transporting populations of Jews into the ghettos. And Jews were required to move from wherever they were in Poland into these large ghettos. They were required to wear labels like they did in the Middle Ages, only now they're using the Star of David specifically. So they have this sort of yellow star that they are required to wear. If they don't wear the yellow star, they're usually executed on sight, shot. Now, they also establish Jewish councils within these ghettos. And most of the ghettos, by the way, they're located next to the really big cities in Poland, Warsaw, Krakow, and other places. Now, when they move Jews into these ghettos, they also organize local government, really, in a sense, local councils, which are called Judenräte, or Jewish councils. And their task is to help govern these Jewish ghettos. Many of them are quite large, and you need some sort of administrative mechanism in place, somebody that the SS can deal with, right? And so the Jewish councils are created. And along with these Jewish councils, they also create a Jewish police force, for example. So every ghetto has its own sort of Jewish government, and it has its own sort of Jewish police force. And there's a lot of controversy over these issues. Whether or not members of the Jewish councils should be viewed as sort of collaborators, or whether they should be viewed as victims themselves, as really not having any choice in this matter. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But certainly the members of the Jewish council, many of them are going to be victims of the Holocaust themselves. You have a situation where the Germans are saying things like, listen, we're going to need your help organizing a transport. We need to either ship out forced laborers. Of course, later we know that they're shipping out Jews for extermination, and they call this transports, by the way. We need to organize a transport. So, you give us 1,000, you organize 1,000 members or several hundred members for a shipment or a transport next week, or we'll come in and we'll just simply kill 2,000 people. So members of the Jewish councils, they're put in these sort of difficult positions where they have to kind of do the choosing for the SS, right? They have to, in a sense, select, who's going to go on these transports. And certainly, in most cases, they're aware. They know that this idea that they're sending Jews out to the east to simply provide labor. They realize that, in fact, certainly over time, certainly by 1942, they realize that Jews are actually being killed. That's where they're going, and this is why you have Jewish councils selecting the older, the sicker folks in the ghetto, in the hopes, in many cases, of giving younger people a chance to survive. You also have stories that are less, or I should say, are more disturbing, where you have certain Jewish councils or Jewish council members choosing their enemies, for example, to be put on transports. And this is why it's a controversial issue, and I believe I asked you to read some pieces about that. All right, so that's sort of how it's initially established and organized. Certainly, the SS establishes it, but they do so. They certainly need to have some assistance in terms of how they operate the day-to-day functions of the ghetto. Now, I want to just say something about, so what's the point of establishing these ghettos? I mean, um, obviously, we know that certainly Jews were killed in them, but is there any other function? Well, certainly the Nazis gave explanations. I mean, the world community was wondering, hey, what's going on? Why are you moving, large populations of Jews into these certain sections of cities? And the Nazis would often claim that they were doing this, for humanitarian purposes, that they were trying to protect Jews from other groups within these countries, blaming, other anti-Semites, that they're trying to pretend in a sense that they were protecting the Jews, or that they were doing this to prevent the spread of disease. So they would make up all kinds of excuses, at least for the public, as to why they were doing this. There's probably four particularly good reasons that we can point to as to what the purpose is. It could be any number of these four. One certainly is natural attrition. It enabled the Nazis to control the flow of supplies and food and medicine for the Jews. So if they needed labor, for example, and this is as we'll see, this is something that they do. They might allow food to flow in. They might allow medicine to be delivered into the ghetto. If they decide that they want to lower the Jewish population and they want to start decimating the population, and they do this as well, they will cut off food shipments. They will cut off medical supplies, and then let people die out. Another reason, another purpose these ghettos serve is confiscation of property. Remember, this is, in many respects, a colonial project. The Nazis are going in with the intention of settling Eastern Europe, and that includes Poland as well. So they are, in a sense, removing the Jews. They're pushing them out of the way. They're confiscating their property, their houses, their apartments. You have some cases Germans coming and moving into those areas in some places. But also, just their goods. Their financial goods. They're taking control when they push Jews into the ghettos. They then can seize their property, their valuables, whatever's in the banks, you name it, it's going to go for the Nazi cause. And even little items, clothing, jewelry, money. Jews are only allowed to carry a certain number of suitcases, right? They're only allowed to carry a couple of suitcases into the ghetto with them, so everything else pretty much falls under Nazi control. Third, labor, as I started to say, it provides a cheap and expendable population that the Germans can use in their factories. Those of you who've seen the film Schindler's List, you see this, right? Jews from the ghettos are used really basically to work for free. They're not paid. They go in, they're slave laborers for particular factories, and then the factory owners might pay the SS something, right? They'll pay the SS for letting them use the prisoners, but of course Jews aren't paid for their labor themselves. And then finally, number four, final solution. As this enabled the Germans to hold the Jews in one location while they develop a plan for the final solution. It made it a lot easier. The reason they were able to kill 6 of the 9 million Jews on the European continent is because many of those Jews were already relocated, in a sense packaged into these ghettos. Made it quite easy to place them on trains going out of the ghettos to the death camps. So this made that sort of systematic approach to exterminating the Jews quite easy. In terms of how the ghettos were organized, I already mentioned, Heinrich Himmler and the SS oversees it. Of course, they have cooperation through these Jewish councils. I say cooperation, which is, that's a kind of a tricky word. You could think of it as forced cooperation, really, in many cases. All right, so what's life like in the ghettos? Well, they're horrific places. The Germans control everything. They control food, electricity, gas, medicine, as I mentioned. They can turn the supply on. They can turn the supply off. Jews are forced into these sort of apartments. You have multiple families living with strangers, for example, at least 7 people perhaps to a room. People are executed for the littlest offenses. If you're caught smuggling food into the ghetto, if you're caught not working or trying to escape, anything like that, you're executed. So the slightest offenses, people are executed. Starvation and disease, of course, is rampant. You have situations in many of these ghettos where you literally have bodies lying on the street. People just drop dead. They just fall down in the street. They're sick. They're dying. Now, usually and this was part of the purposes of having Jewish councils, they would organize, usually, in conjunction with the SS, to have the bodies picked up, right, for sanitary purposes. But sometimes the Nazis, the SS, would punish the ghetto, would punish the Jewish council, or punish the Jews living in the ghetto by not allowing them to bury the dead, leaving the dead out in the streets. And this creates this kind of hellish environment. Usually, at some point, they would come in and have the bodies removed because they feared the spread of disease. Because, of course, when disease spreads, it not only affects the Jewish population, but it also affects the SS who are governing it. But we do know, certainly, that there are examples of this where Jews are dying in the street, and they are left there basically to rot. So terrible, you can imagine, terrible, nasty conditions in the ghettos. And of course, escape was very difficult, if not impossible. And a lot of people say, well, why don't you just leave the ghetto or slip out overnight? And certainly, there are cases of people doing that. We even have also cases of people sneaking into the ghettos so they could see what was going on, taking photos and things like that. There are a few examples of that. But it's very difficult. It's very difficult to get in and out of the ghettos. But also, they're patrolled. The perimeters are patrolled. But it's probably the most difficult aspect of it is that you have policies that really make leaving the ghetto difficult. So if somebody escapes, for example, the Germans would always react to this with what they called sort of collective response or collective punishment, and it was a very effective technique. Whereas a person escapes, flees the ghetto, what do? Well, you kill every member of their family. You basically execute everybody related to them. If they don't have any family, then you execute their co-workers, or perhaps you execute everybody that lived on their floor in whatever particular building they lived in. This is the kind of tactic that the Nazis take. And so it's fairly effective. People generally aren't willing to put other people at risk to that extent, although things like that did happen. So it certainly was, a horrendous situation. Probably the best known ghetto most people are familiar with is the Warsaw Ghetto. Of course, there's many ghettos, but the Warsaw Ghetto is perhaps the best known. There was an uprising there in 1943. I'll talk about that later. But a tremendous number of people died in the ghetto. I think it's estimated something like 100,000 Jews died of starvation just between 1940 and 1942. So huge loss of life, and it wasn't much different in the other ghettos, where you had people basically dying of starvation and disease quite often. Now, ghettos, eventually all ghettos are liquidated, and what I mean by this is that at some point they close the ghettos down, they come in, and first they organize so-called transports, where they have the Jewish councils begin to organize the loading up of people onto freight cars, for example, under the pretense that they're going to work as laborers in the East, and then they're brought to one of the 6 death camps, which I'll tell you about in a moment, where they are, of course, gassed and the bodies cremated. So all ghettos, eventually are shut down and liquidated in this manner. And then sometimes people, of course, were aware. They were aware of what was going on. Certainly this is the case in Krakow and Warsaw and other ghettos where there are uprisings. So what happens is those people who don't get on the transports, who refuse to get on the trains or the trucks going to the camps, run into the sewers, they hide. In some cases, they fight back. In other cases, they try to seal themselves up in basements and sewers. You name it. What winds up happening is SS task forces go in and basically root everybody out, shoot them and execute them, drag them out. In a sense, just kill them within the ghetto, and they do this one by one during the Second World War. They begin to sort of seal off the ghettos and proceed to kill people. Now, while this is going on, really sort of, pretty much at the same time, you have those mass shootings also taking place that I mentioned last time, right? So you have these special SS, again, the SS involved, pretty much in all of this. You have those special units, those special task forces, as they're called, Einsatzgruppen. And there's a couple of different ways you can translate that word. Sometimes they're called special action squads. Other times they're referred to as task force. And what these were primarily men from other SS units, although occasionally they also took men out of the German army, the Wehrmacht, and there probably were a few members from the state police, the police battalions that were placed into the Einsatzgruppen. But for the most part, these were Waffen-SS SS men that had been trained to fight on the battlefield, but they used them for this sort of special purpose. And the Einsatzgruppen accompany, what they do is they pretty much follow the German Wehrmacht. As the German army invades into Russia in June of 1941, you have these task force following them. And their job is to essentially sweep up Jews, gypsies, I should say Roma and Sinti, so-called gypsies, and also, in some cases, Polish resistors, political prisoners, and others. But the primary focus of the Einsatzgruppen is to round up the Jewish communities that they come into contact with after the major fighting takes place with the Wehrmacht and Soviet forces. Then the Einsatzgruppen sweep in, and they organize large executions. Now, I said they're not alone in this. They're accompanied also in many cases by these police battalions. Now, remember the order police, that essay I asked you to read by Browning talks about the order police. They're a little bit different. They're state police that are basically taken from Germany and then transported to help the Einsatzgruppen carry out these killing projects. And they kill a lot of people, many of these order police, as you know. And they're also helped. They're assisted also by Ukrainians, Latvians, and others who, not all Ukrainians, not all Latvians, but those ones that either sympathize with the Nazis or just, are anti-Semitic. They join in this sort of killing frenzy in many cases. So we know at least probably 2,700,000 Jews were killed in these mass shootings that were organized by the Einsatzgruppen. And I know I've probably shown this image several times. Many of you have seen it, very disturbing images. And the two I have up in front of you now are actually, I believe, from Ukraine. the picture on the left, there's been some controversy. A lot of people like to argue, well, we don't really know if this is an SS member executing a woman who's holding her child. I mean, we certainly know that they did that, but there's been a lot of people who have sort of challenged this photo. I mean, we do know the photo's real. The photo was sent from a particular Einsatzgruppen battalion back to Germany, so it was mailed, and it was intercepted in the mail. That's how folks got the picture, and it's written on the back, Ukraine. I forget the exact city, but it's written on the back with the date. So it was as if the soldier was sending this back to back home to say, hey, look what's going on. Look at me. I'm shooting a woman in the back of the head. Now that might seem entirely crazy, and of course it is, but just give you kind of sense of the mentality at the time, that there were people who were actually quite proud of this. And this is why we do have so much photographic evidence. That there's lots of cases of photos being taken almost as sort of memorabilia, people in a sense trying to remember. Now, do we know what happened to this woman exactly? No. And there's a longer image. In other words, this is cropped from a much larger photo where you also see other German soldiers. It looks like they're digging. It's not clear what they're digging. But anyway, it's possible, I suppose, that this is somebody just posing for the picture. But there's probably a very good chance that, in fact, he was getting ready to murder this woman and her child. And we have other photographs that are equally disturbing that show, in fact, the aftermath of this sort of pose. Now, to the right, we see a Ukrainian Jewish man leaning over a ditch, and he's about to be executed. And from what I recall, the something like the words "the last Jew of Vilna" or something like that, I forget what exact city it was, is written on the back of the photo. Again, somebody sending the photo back home as if to say, to show how proud they were that they had executed, this terrible enemy of the Reich. Now, the photo, of course, is disturbing, but there's some interesting things about it outside of that. If you look in the back, right behind where the victim is about to be shot, you see a young boy in a very sort of dark uniform. That's a Hitler Youth. It's sort of strange. So this is not a member of the military. This is actually a young boy, probably 14 or 15 years old or something like that, who's won sort of a contest to accompany the SS Einsatzgruppen on their sort of killing campaign. And this was something, we know about this because this was something they did with the Hitler Youth, where they would, in a sense, choose a member from particular districts, particular Hitler Youth districts. It was like winning a competition where you were selected and you could then, in a sense, go off and join either an army or usually it was an SS organizer. You would go off and join hang out with an SS unit and get to see what they do. It was a kind of way of training and indoctrinating young Nazis. So certainly very disturbing based on that alone. Now, as I said, these shootings were massive, and I had shown that image before of the Babi Yar massacre, where you have at least 33,000 people killed between September 29th and September 30th. Right, so that kind of killing is going on all over the Eastern Front. Right, so probably nearly 3 million or so Jews. You figure anywhere from 2,700,000 to 3 million, right, are killed this way. Right, that's a lot of Jews are executed. I mentioned last time that the killing gets to be so much that they decide they have to figure out a better way of sort of removing this population of Jews. And I asked you to watch those film clips on the film Conspiracy, which talks about the Wannsee Conference, right? And the Wannsee Conference met January 20th, 1942, and they basically try to get a systematic plan together. I mean, they're already really sort of carrying out killing in many places, but they want to make sure that everybody within sort of the various branches of the Nazi military and government, or Third Reich, I should say, Third Reich's military and government, and various SS organizations are all, in a sense, coordinated and working with each other on this project, which is given priority. And one of the things I said had happened is Himmler was upset because he felt it was too traumatic for men to have to keep killing people, for 48 hours straight. So the idea is we need to develop a better way, and of course they do. They figure out a more systematic way of exterminating Jews, and they do this by coming up by expanding on that concentration camp system, which of course they had already begun to expand even before the war broke out. But now they're going to add an extra feature. They're going to really develop death camps where killing can be carried out more efficiently. All right, now a word about the camps, and I do want you to pay attention here. There is a difference between when we're talking about sort of labor camps, work camps, right? Those are concentration camps as well, right? Work camps. It's just another word for concentration camp. So when I say concentration camp, you could also say work camp or labor camp, right? Those are just other words for concentration camps. Absolutely horrible places, and as I said, nearly 20,000 camps are created. I'm certainly not going to give you 20,000 names, but I'd like you to remember a couple examples. You should know at least 3, okay? And certainly, I'm sure most of you could come up with more than that, reading the textbook and the other reading selections I asked you to look at. But I put 3 examples here of some fairly well-known concentration camps. They include Dachau, Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald, and of course there's lots more. But then I also pointed out that there are sort of six death camps, and these were places where Jews were sort of systematically killed, right? They're brought in and they're gassed and they're executed. And these include Helmno, okay, which was one of the first sort of killing centers as the extermination camps, as they were referred to. It was established in December 1941, and they killed a lot of Jews, a lot of Roma and Sinti, the so-called gypsies, a lot of Russian prisoners of war were gassed. Initially they used vans, mobile vans that they sealed up and then gassed people there. So they estimate probably 152,000 people were killed at Helmno between December 1941 and March of 1943. Belzec, originally designed as sort of a regular concentration camp, but in 1941 they start to use it really as one of these extermination centers. Probably about 434,000 Jews, an undetermined number of Poles and Roma and Sinti were killed there. Sobibor was constructed. This is another death camp, extermination camp. Was constructed in 1942. So a huge number of people were killed there. They think about 167,000 Jews were killed in Sobibor. And the camp it's a famous site in terms of talking about the death camps because there was an uprising, and in fact Jews did escape from Sobibor, and they killed the SS guards and there were Ukrainians that were helping guard the prison as well. And they managed to escape, but most of them were killed crossing a minefield that surrounded the camp. I'll talk about that later when we talk about resistance. Treblinka, another major extermination camp, death camp, horrific killing center. It's estimated that somewhere between 870,000 to 925,000 Jews were killed in Treblinka. Probably the best known death camp that I know many of you are familiar with. Most people, when you ask them to name a camp, this is usually the one that they think of, is of course the Auschwitz concentration camp. complex, as it's referred to. Now, what you should know about that is it, in fact, it's made up of really sort of three major camps. And I believe all three camps had, I should say two of the camps had working gas chambers in them. Auschwitz I had a gas chamber. It had a crematorium, although that wasn't necessarily its primary function. It certainly had a labor force there. It also had what's called Block 10, which is really sort of this place where they conducted a lot of experimentation on people. Many of you have probably heard of Dr. Joseph Mengele, the so-called Angel of Death. He did a lot of horrific experiments there on children, in particular twins. I'll talk about that in a bit. Auschwitz II, also sometimes called Auschwitz-Birkenau, right, is another major sort of, it's actually a camp in itself, really. It has two large working gas chambers, and it has 4 crematoriums. It also has sort of large areas where they have housing for men, women, and entire families that are imprisoned there. Okay, so it's probably the largest of our 3 parts of the Auschwitz complex, and it's really here where the sort of extermination program is carried out. Much of the extermination, where Jews are brought in, told to undress, that they're going to be taking showers, and then of course they're gassed and the bodies are cremated. So Auschwitz II is sort of the killing center, you could think of as a part of the camp. And then Auschwitz III is really a sort of slave labor camp. This is where they house slave laborers that they use to work in their chemical and rubber producing factories, right? Their synthetics factories, which are run. And some of the other death camps have similar structures. So where you have actually both a kind of labor camp and a death camp combined together. Okay, so even though I categorize it here with death camps, it also had a labor component to it. And this is also true of the other death camps that I mentioned. Most of them, some of them, like Sobibor, I think were exclusively, and Treblinka were almost exclusively, certainly towards the end of the war, used as killing centers with a very tiny workforce, meaning just enough people to kind of clean up the bodies and bury them. But some of these death camps also had sort of a fairly decent sized labor population that they used for particular projects, either to keep the camp going itself, but in some cases they might have slave laborers working in a local factory that was housed there, for example. But certainly they're known as death camps because their primary function is to execute and kill Jews, to exterminate Jews. So most of those Jews aren't given the option of being laborers. And then eventually the laborers themselves are going to be executed. They're going to be placed in the gas chambers. And they do this through a process of selection. Selection takes place both as Jews arrive, certainly in these death camps where they're separated. They will take some out that they think can be used as workers, as laborers, and then the others are sent off to the gas chambers immediately. And most of the time in the death camps, children, there are exceptions, but for the most part, children are sent off for execution immediately. They're not considered really essential workers. Also, it generally tended to be harder for women, although they did have women. Some of the death camps had a female labor force. In many places, women generally were executed. The elderly, children, women, and they would just pick young male laborers, for example, in some places to survive. Now that's a process of selection, but then over time, even those people that are picked as laborers to work in the camps would be, in a sense, put through this process where, as time goes on, of course, they'd be deprived of food and medicine, and most of them were becoming sickly. They would then be weeded out and gassed themselves, And they always had an influx of new prisoners, from whatever country they had recently invaded, Romania, Hungary, or wherever they were going, to replace the population of those Jews that were no longer capable of working. All right, what was life like? In these camps, and I'm sure most of you have some sense that it was pretty horrific. As I said, upon arrival, they're sort of separated, and you have families being separated from one another. So family comes in, and you hear these stories all the time of parents being separated from their children, husbands being separated from their wives. It's the last time they see them. They're taken off as slave laborers, as prisoners, and they're told that their wives and children are going to take showers, and they never see them again. And of course they're gassed. They're gassed, and their bodies are burned. And you could imagine what it must be like to suddenly find yourself being beaten, being forced to provide labor, while at the same time, you're being told that your family has just been killed. So utterly, horrendous places. Now, as they come into the camp system, things are organized in such a way where you have certain leaders that oversee particular labor battalions, and these are known as capos, K-A-P-O-S, or capos, and these usually were other prisoners from the camp, usually not always though, violent criminals, people who had been arrested for murder. In some cases they were political prisoners. But in most cases, they were people who had committed, horrific crimes. And the Nazis, the SS, I should say, choose them usually to be capos because they know they'll be brutal. They know they're going to be harsh. They know they're prone to violence, and they know they'll be capable of ruling over the other inmates. So absolutely, it's a horrendous situation. Everybody's labeled. And I'll come back to this again when I talk about the different victim groups. So, different groups have different colors. They have different triangles that are placed on their uniform. For example, if you're homosexual, you have pink triangle. If you're a political prisoner, you might have a red triangle, and so forth. And they do this as a way of kind of, in a sense, not only making it easy to identify and clearly organize the camp, but in a way it sort of sets people up against each other too. So different groups. Primo Levi was a young Italian chemist who was imprisoned in Auschwitz, and he describes this kind of hierarchy of prisoners. And just how brutal the prisoners could be to one another in this camp system. All right, so now I was talking before about the death camps, but also just the camps in general are horrendous places. So really, the way a concentration camp is organized and the way a death camp is organized, relatively, pretty much the same on the level of horror. Right, except in one you have large numbers of people being brought in and killed constantly, while this sort of smaller labor population exists in misery. So in the concentration camps you have a larger labor population. That's all, and in a sense, utterly horrific places. Now, it's begun to say experimentation takes place in both concentration camps and death camps. And I started to talk about Auschwitz. Joseph Mengele, the Angel of Death, just absolutely horrific. We know he performed experiments on at least 1,500 sets of imprisoned twins. I believe most of them, or many of them, were gypsies. He also used Jewish prisoners as well. Conducted, just supposedly genetic-based experiments. He would inject children's eyes with different colors to see if he could change their eyes from brown to blue, for example. he would inject dyes into their skin to see if he could change the color of their skin. Most of this resulted in blindness, death, disease, you name it. Horrific. We know he did sort of horrific experiments in which he made conjoined twins. In other words, he took two twins that were separate and basically sewed them together, sewed their organs together to see how long they could share a common organ, for example, before they died. We know he did live vivisections, where he basically dissected children while they were awake, right, while they were conscious. He was cutting them open, performing experiments on the body. Absolutely horrendous experiments, and of course he used twins, so he could use one as a kind of litmus, so he could test as a sort of as a way of measuring the differences in the experiments he was doing. Horrific stuff, and of course they called him the Angel of Death because he actually. Those who were fortunate enough to survive, they remember him as being sort of almost pleasant when they met him. He would come, he would give children candy, give them little toys. He seemed almost like a humane person. But then once they were in the barracks and in this program, he would then conduct these horrific experiments. And unfortunately, he escaped justice. He went off to live in South America in secret for many years, and I think he died. He drowned in the early 1970s while swimming. So unfortunately, and this unfortunately is true of many of these horrible SS men, both the doctors and the soldiers. All right, what else do they do in these camps? Horrible hypothermia experiments were done in Dachau, for example. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, conducted experiments to see how long somebody could survive in ice water. So they would submerge prisoners in ice cold water for 3 hours just to see how long they would survive before they would die. This way they would know, for example, how much time was needed to rescue a Luftwaffe pilot who fell in the North Sea, for example, during winter. That was the purpose of this experiment, really to gain statistical data. Other experiments also done in Dachau. By the way, Dachau is a concentration camp, not a death camp. Other experiments was to put Jewish prisoners in a low-pressure chamber. They would contain these to simulate conditions of being at least 66,000 feet in the air, and the idea was to see how long it would take before the blood vessels in their head exploded, before they died, what the effects would be. Would they become demented, depending on the altitude. So, horrible stuff. We know that at least 200 people died in just one of these experiments. And then the others were, the ones that had survived, in many cases, were then dissected while they were alive to see how their organs, how their various organs had reacted to the experience. So really nasty stuff. And most of these dissections focused really on the brain, right? They in a sense wanted to see what had happened to the brain. Other experiments, both in these camps, and certainly they did one in Buchenwald, was known for its experiments with various diseases. They would infect people with malaria or typhus deliberately to see how long it would take for them to die, and then to try various medications to see which was more effective. So anyway, absolutely horrendous places. And what I'd like you to do when you watch the two films that I asked you to watch that are part of this sort of unit under lectures and presentations on Blackboard, I want you to try to make a note of some of the things that are done in the camp, certainly the procedure of the prisoners' experience, how they get there, what happens to them ultimately, how things are done and carried out. This is the kind of stuff you should be paying attention to while you watch the film. All right, so the camps, what can be said? They're horrific places, human experimentation, just brutal murder, both in the labor camps and in the death camps. Now, another important term I think you should know is Sonderkommando, which means sort of special commando or special workforce. Those were the prisoners, certainly the ones that had been selected for labor in many cases, who were specifically used for the purpose of cleaning the bodies out of the gas chambers, helping that sort of killing procedure take place. Of course, they're forced to do this. They want to live, so they essentially do this task where they they collect their fellow Jews and others' belongings, help sort of organize the lines going into the gas chambers. And then they're the same folks who would then go in and drag the bodies out after they had been gassed, and then place those bodies either in in those death camps that had functioning crematoriums, and most of them did. They would put them in crematoriums and then burn the bodies. Other cases, they had to dig pits nearby the camps. In some cases, they just couldn't keep up. There were so many bodies to burn that they wound up just digging huge pits with grates in them, almost like a giant barbecue pit, where they could put layers and layers of bodies, and then they would burn them that way, right? Because it was actually that many. They were killing that many people. Now, towards the end of the war, as the Russians were pushing further and further westward, in particular, you start to have a scenario where the Germans, realizing that they're losing the war, begin to retreat backward, and back towards Germany, back into the west, and one of the things they're concerned about is now they're worried that people are going to find out about this. As the Russians invade, certainly they come into the death camp Majdanek. By the way, I just want to make sure that everybody knows, because I do expect you to know the 6 death camps. I want you to know the names of the 6 death camps. I want you to know at least the names of 3 regular concentration camps. There's 20,000, so you should be able to remember 3. The death camps, by the way, I think I mentioned, I just want to make sure, were Helmno, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, the Auschwitz complex, which actually has 3 in 1, really, right? And Majdanek. Okay, those were the death camps. So I was beginning to say, as the Russians were invading further westward, pushing the Germans back, one of the first camps they come across is Majdanek, and they go in and they just see what's going on. So now the Germans are aware, and of course the Red Cross and others are finding out what's going on. And the Nazis want to deny this, especially the ones that are heavily involved in the SS. At least that's one of the reasons. One of the reasons is they begin to forcibly evacuate these death camps and concentration camps as well, and march the prisoners. And these are called death marches because, for obvious reasons. So there's any number of reasons why they actually have organize these death marches. Certainly, they want to hide. They want to hide the fact that they've been killing people. They don't want those witnesses telling the Russians and then later the Americans and the English forces that are coming in from the west, because then they'll also find out what's been happening. So that's certainly one reason. The other reason was possibly that they wanted to have, a labor force. Some of them did want to maintain slave laborers that they could then use back in Germany. but probably really the two main reasons I would say again is secrecy. They don't want people to know what's been going on, but also hostages. And we see this a little bit with Heinrich Himmler and others. So towards the war's end, when they realize that Germany's going to lose the war, they try to negotiate. They try to say, "Oh, I'll be able to spare so many Jews' lives, or I might be able to help you save so many lives. If you promise not to execute me, or promise, a fair deal after the war." We do see a little of this sort of negotiating going on. The Allies don't negotiate, but we see certainly SS leaders making motions in this direction. So that's certainly one reason why they start these death marches. And of course they're called death marches because they're marching people, literally marching people to their death. These are sick prisoners. They've been mistreated so long. And then as they're going along, in many cases the SS just decides to start killing them along the way and burying the bodies, in a sense, in sort of mass graves in the countryside. And we have photos where we see them, digging up these graves where people have been shot. They had been marched from one camp further westward. Now, in the West, certainly as the American, British, and other Allied forces also encounter the same things that the Russians are encountering as they come in from the East, they start to find these death camps. So the Germans also start, the death marches there. All right. So, I just want you to be aware of the term death marches and what's involved in that context. Okay, we'll come back and revisit some of these issues. I just wanted to try to put them in some perspective for today. And I think the films that I've asked you to watch should really fess out a lot of the details I wasn't really able to talk about. Okay, and hopefully those of you who have questions, there's certainly things that are brought up in the film, many of them disturbing things, that you may have questions about. I would encourage you to either bring them up in your other discussions, or you could go to that general class forum that I have set up. There is a general discussion board. Nobody's posted in it. But if you have a question, or if you see something interesting that you'd like to talk about with your fellow students, please post it there about the films, okay? Because there are a number of disturbing things. Now, when you're watching this film, Night and Fog, which is a French film, you should know it's a French film. I think most of you will recognize the language when you hear it is English subtitles. Hopefully you'll be able to watch it on your computer screen with little trouble. Sometimes it's a little hard to see the subtitles, but you should be able to see it. This is the first film ever made about concentration camps, and that's why you'll see some familiar images that appear in other documentaries and actually probably appear in the other documentary I'm going to ask you to watch. Again, these are short films. Night and Fog, I think, is about half an hour. And the other film clip is, I think, like 15 minutes or 16 minutes or something like that, which is Path to Genocide, which is put out by the United States Holocaust Museum, and I only asked you to watch a segment of that, right? So just look where I wrote where to begin watching. I forget exactly at the moment. I think it was 24 minutes or something like that. You can begin watching it. So let me know. In Night and Fog, just a few things. One... there is one major error in that film where they talk about soap, I believe, being made from the bodies, from the fat from Jewish bodies. That's not really true. They didn't, and they're not lying. They were under that assumption when they discovered these chemicals. They weren't sure what they were. There is probably, I think there was one or two cases where there were factories that experimented with this idea. They wanted to make something out of human fat from the victims, but that was just, I think it was one factory that did that. And it never, in other words, it didn't become part of a systematic project. However, the other things you see in that film are true. The things they do with human hair and and the other obviously the other atrocities that take place in the camps. I'll warn you. Obviously, I'm sure you have some sense of this, that you're going to see a lot of disturbing images in those films. So, just prepare yourself for that in case, if you know you're the kind of person that's upset easily by disturbing images. You should expect to see that given the topic matter that we're discussing. All right, that's it for now. Have a good night, and I will see you on Blackboard.